What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video, and I am so excited to be bringing you the things you need to know for Pro Tour AETHERDRIFT. We're going to be covering what formats the players are playing, what they're playing for, where they're playing at, how you can watch at home, and then breaking down both formats they're going to be playing. And yes, both formats might be confusing to you if you've not seen the Pro Tour, if you're kind of new to the setup, because it is a little bit unique at the Pro Tour and the World Championship level than it is from the regional championships and even the Spotlight Series that you may have seen early on this year. And since we wrapped up the World Championship all the way back in October, it's been that long since we've had essentially this level of competition, and I am so excited to be getting back into the competitive season and bringing you all the news and the things you need to know. But of course, before we get into any of that stuff, there's a few more things you need to know, like if you enjoy anything you've seen in this video, if you're just having fun, you learn something, or you just want to see more content from me, please consider subscribing, ring the notification bell, and of course, leaving a like on the video. All are free, easy ways to support me and my content. It takes 2 to 3 clicks, and if you want to support me even further, I got some other cool stuff down in the description. One, going to my Discord server. You can follow that link, join over there, and we can talk about stuff going on with the Pro Tour, maybe something you're doing as a Magic player. I do greatly appreciate it, and trying to build more of a community over there. I've been playing a lot of Limited, and I've been posting, I've posted exactly one of my deck lists that I ended up actually getting 7 wins with on Arena, so definitely I want to see that kind of stuff and how people are enjoying this new Limited format. And of course, check out the Casual Spikes YouTube channel, where we're also going to be covering the Pro Tour in a little bit of a different way. We're going to be tackling it from a different perspective than I'm going to be tackling it here. So if you want that kind of unique perspective, and check out my co-host Randy over at MTG with Randy, you can follow the link in the description down below to the podcast. Finally, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. Manatraders is a monthly subscription service where you can rent cards for Magic the Gathering online. Heck, even in some of the decks that you see at the Pro Tour, you can end up renting them and playing them through leagues and challenges on Magic Online to get qualifier points, prizes, and then maybe qualify for the Pro Tour through the online route, which is something that, a lot of players do end up doing. And honestly, I enjoy playing online, especially when doing all the play testing and stuff like that. So if that is something that interests you, please use my code in the description down below to sign up for Manatraders today, and you'll get 5% off your monthly subscription. With that all the way, let's go ahead and start off our video with things you need to know for Pro Tour AETHERDRIFT. So here we have the viewer's guide for Pro Tour AETHERDRIFT, written by Rich Hagan. This is where we're going to start because it's going to lay out some of the information that we're going to explain and expand upon further in this video, so you definitely want to stick around if you want to learn more about the things kind of going on at the Pro Tour, because the Pro Tour, like I said in the beginning, does kind of handle things differently from other tournaments you might be used to, where the Regional Championship and the Spotlight Series have very specific formats. If they're playing Modern, they're playing Modern the whole time from start to finish. If it's Sealed, then they're playing Sealed deck. Maybe that they end up having another sealed pool come to a different day, whatever the case may be. But the Pro Tour is built a little different, as the kids say. So this being in Chicago at MagicCon Chicago, and Chicago is a very rich history. It says here in this little blurb at the beginning that every person that has won the Pro Tour in Chicago has ended up being in the Hall of Fame. That would being Seth Manfield, Kai Budde twice, Bob Maher, the great one, and then Dirk Babarowski and Randy Buehler, who Randy Buehler used to be a person that did like the commentating and stuff back in the day for Magic the Gathering. I'm not exactly sure about Dirk Babarowski, but Kai Budde is also one of the greatest Pro Tour players of all time. I believe a one-time world champion, top-aided the last World Championship, and has the Player of the Year trophy named after them, so congratulations to them. And of course, Seth Manfield also was in the running and actually beat Kai Budde in the World Championship just this past year. So there's a lot of pedigree at this Pro Tour. Now, does that necessarily mean that whoever wins this one is going to end up in the Hall of Fame? No, but it's actually really cool that over the 30-plus years of having a Pro Tour, or about like 28 years, I would say, having a Chicago Pro Tour, that all of them that have won it, and every time it's been there, that person has made the Hall of Fame, is kind of a neat stat to kind of think about there. But what is the Pro Tour? It is a culmination of many paths, all competitive, to one of Magic's most prestigious tournaments. You can qualify through the Pro Tour through the kind of RCQ route, where you go to a store, win a regional championship qualifier, go to the regional championship. In the United States, it's top 32. You can qualify for the Pro Tour and that way, and of course get other qualifications as you go up, or if you make the finals of a regional championship, you can actually qualify for the World Championship as well. And the Pro Tour is kind of the same way, where you're using the Pro Tour to either qualify for regional championships and the Pro Tour, and if you do even better past that, you can actually qualify for the World Championship through the Pro Tour, which is really neat there. But there's a $500,000 cash prize plus a trophy up for grabs for first place. I believe it's only the top 8 end up actually qualifying for the World Championship, along with some other things that we'll kind of get into in a moment, or really later down the line when we actually get to the World Championship. But nearly 250 competitors from RC events, top finishers from previous Pro Tours, Arena, and Magic Online Premier Play, and more have invitations to Pro Tour AETHERDRIFT, and the list of invitations is available online and subject to change apparently, but you can click on this link here and you'll see who's actually able to participate in the Pro Tour. But here where you can watch the Pro Tour, it is on Twitch and it's on YouTube. I personally prefer YouTube because you can kind of rewind. I'm usually watching on mobile a lot of the time anyway, and I don't necessarily get to see and watch what's going on. I'm just kind of having to do other things like around the house or whatever. So I'm going to be listening to a lot of the Pro Tour of like what's going on, sitting down, watching what I can. And I just prefer YouTube because then if something happens and I'm like, well, hold on, I can rewind and actually watch what happened and then go on and kind of continue about my day. And of course, speed up to actually catch up to the live of what's happening. But here you can see here on day 1, day 2, which will be Friday and Saturday, will be AETHERDRIFT draft and standard constructed on day 1 and day 2. So that's probably confusing to some people because, again, in the beginning, I talked about how, the regional championships and the spotlight events all kind of focus on one singular format. The Pro Tour technically focuses on 2, one of them being the limited portion of the event where you do standard booster draft, where each player is going to open a pack, select a card from that pack, pass the pack to either direction. I believe it's the right direction. I don't know if they necessarily change it up or anything like that, but they pass it to the right, and then they will pick up the pack that they were just passed, pick a card from there, so on until that pack is gone. Rinse and repeat for packs 2 and 3, and you build a 40 card constructed deck from the cards that you drafted, and then you play 3 rounds of draft. Standard constructed, of course, you have a deck that is registered at that event, so you will, I believe deck submissions are usually like on Wednesday. I believe it'll probably say somewhere later in the article, but from there, you end up playing that deck for 5 rounds. And then if you have a 4-4 record or better, you end up coming back for day 2, where we essentially do it all over again until we have the top 8 players. So the 8 players with the best record plus tiebreakers, whatever the case may be, and they will play a single elimination top 8, which is just standard constructed, and which is actually best of 5, where maybe you see like a top 8 again from a regional championship or from a spotlight series. It is always best of 3 in the Pro Tour and the World Championship. It is best of 5 in the single elimination rounds there. So something that's kind of neat. Especially if you're not used to it, that is just more Magic to play. Technically, more chances for a player to come back and win the series, even if they go down 2-0. They don't just lose 2-0. They end up having 3 more games where they can come back and win. And it has happened before. We actually saw in the World Championship in the semifinals, the eventual winner Javier Dominguez coming back and reverse sweeping Seth Manfield in the semifinals, to then make the finals, and of course beating Marcio Carvalho in the finals. And if you're interested in that recap of how the World Championship ended, I have a full day 1, day 2 breakdown plus a total recap of the top 8 as well for those videos if you want to check that out. But going forward, Friday, Saturday, that's going to be the big thing, starting at noon Eastern time. So here on the East Coast, it'll be at noon, 9 o'clock Pacific time, on the West Coast. And then anybody else that may have a different time zone, you're going to have to be in charge of looking that up, because I am not 100% sure of all 24 time zones. I know, bad content creator, whatever. So with that said, 12 p.m. Eastern time, 9 a.m. Pacific time on the West Coast for day 1 and day 2, which will be Friday, Saturday. And then Sunday, it'll be 11 a.m. So it's going to start an hour earlier than we are used to from the first and second day of competition, which then we're going to get all 4 quarterfinal matches, followed by the semifinals, and then the finals of Pro Tour AETHERDRIFT. We're not going to be able to see every single match kind of play out to its natural conclusion. I believe last time we ended up seeing 2 or 3 of the quarterfinals, but we got the tail end of the 3rd one, and then we got a really sped up version of the 4th quarterfinal. So we're not going to necessarily see all 7 matches of Magic being played out physically on camera, but we are going to see most of them. Especially, again, when you get to the semifinals, you're going to be able to see both of them. And then, of course, the finals as well. It's the only match that's kind of going on there of significance at MagicCon. But that said, we then get to the start of the tournament, where it's 16 rounds of Swiss pairing, meaning that you could play someone with the same record as you whenever possible, with 2 cutoffs, points along the way. First players must reach 12 match points, which we talk about 4-4 or better, over 8 rounds on day 1 to advance to day 2, with then top 8 playing single elimination. There is something new to the Pro Tour and stuff that they have been doing that's new, where typically in other events this doesn't happen. If you reach a certain point threshold, which I believe is like 36 match points or 39 match points, you automatically qualify for the top 8. So if you're the first player, say, to go 12-0, 13-0, whatever the case may be, in a 16-round tournament, you automatically have buys for the rest of the day. You do not have to play the last 3 rounds of Swiss. You will just automatically qualify, and if you're the first person to do so, you're the number 1 seed overall. No fuss, no mess. You don't have to play anymore, and then so on and so forth for the rest of the positions until we eventually get to the last round, and there's like a few spots up for grabs for top 8. I think that's really cool to do, because instead of just kind of hoping for handshakes, especially if you're pacing the field, maybe players are more likely to draw with you if you are kind of the top seed. So this just kind of keeps more of the players, I guess, engaged, because now they can't get necessarily paired against the person that's 12-0, 13-0. They end up getting paired against someone that's a little bit closer in their range. You could also, in theory, with how this is set up, where you could play someone in draft or maybe in constructed, and then your records are relatively similar, you could possibly end up in the same draft pod playing against each other. And then I think it also works out where you can then like play that person in the Swiss as well. So there's a chance that we could see players play against the same person like 2 or 3 times, albeit you play them once in the draft and you can play them once in the constructed. I believe is how that ends up working out, because I think it has happened from time to time. But these are some of the draft archetypes. We're going to go more in depth later, but this is kind of just a quick snapshot of what you're looking at. There's like 10 2-color combinations, and that's what players are going to kind of look to get into. Now, with the Pro Tour, especially with the constructed decks, the draft decks, people go pretty deep. We've seen other formats where players have played 5 colors, and the 5-color decks have actually been really cool. Players that have drafted kind of in a certain archetype, but they've played out a certain way, or like they've splashed a specific color that maybe isn't necessarily the best color for that 2-color combination, and the deck just ends up looking really sweet. You'll see a lot of high-level drafting here where players are pivoting off certain things, maybe going, pivoting into sort of things, pivoting out of different strategies. It's just a lot of fun. I really enjoy drafting because I think it definitely tests kind of like your knowledge of the format and exactly, as long as you know like what's going on, reading signals and things like that, which we made a short kind of as a way to like how to get better at draft. And again, watching players at the highest level of Magic kind of doing this sort of thing is a lot of fun, honestly. And I really do enjoy the first few hours of the event being specifically about the limited format. And this one is really sweet to boot. So definitely going to be awesome. And then a lot of this is like your countdown sort of thing where, people may be 10-1, 11-0, but normally if you're at about like 4-4 after day 1, you're not really in contention for top 8. It's very likely that you are not going to make top 8 if you go into day 2 at 4-4. But if you end up picking up 4 losses, basically at any point in the tournament, it's going to be very hard to make the top 8. And then, of course, this starting the Player of the Year race. And really quickly here, too, there is the schedule for, the premier events this year. So MagicCon being this weekend at MagicCon Chicago, featuring the Pro Tour. And then Vegas is June 20th through the 22nd for the second Pro Tour. Atlanta, September 26th to the 28th. And the World Championship location and date to be determined, but set for December of 2025 will end the competitive year with the World Championship. So that's going to be kind of exciting to pick up on. Of course, you will be, you will be able to still qualify for MagicCon Las Vegas or MagicCon Atlanta, or even the World Championship. There is still RCQs going on currently for the standard format that you can go and qualify for the upcoming regional championships, which I believe are in Hartford and Minnesota for this current regional championship qualifier season. That then I believe qualifies you for MagicCon Atlanta, because I believe this set of regional championships qualifies you for Vegas. So there's still some time you can go and do that, and then even in those regional championships, you can then qualify for the World Championship if you end up making the finals of the event. So pretty cool there. There's some more kind of like anecdotes and stuff. And finally, I want to start with end with the broadcast team before we kind of move into the specifics of the limited and standard format here. Broadcast team is awesome. The big thing that I'm really excited about here is the return of Riley Knight in the booth. Easily one of my singular favorite commentators just because he brings a lot of energy, super funny guy. I absolutely enjoy Riley being in the booth. It looks like he's going to be more at like the news desk and things like that, with Marshall Sutcliffe and Paul Cheon, also two very good commentators doing the matches along with Loney and Corey, which again, they've been doing the Spotlight Series. They did the last regional championship in the United States in, I believe it was Portland. So again, like a really great commentating team. Of course, Maria and Monty also very, very good. Just an awesome crew here for this broadcast team. And if you've never seen a Pro Tour, if you've never seen them kind of put on a show or anything like that, it's 1,000% worth it to tune in and watch because it is just it's so much fun. Competitive Magic can be stressful. You can definitely make it stressful on yourself. So it's kind of cool when you have a commentating team that is equal parts, like knows what's going on. It can go pretty deep into certain lines of play and maybe find things that you necessarily wouldn't find. That's kind of what you want from a commentator, but also in the same level, it's very entertaining and it's something that's pretty easy to digest. And they just do a fantastic job of doing these sort of things and making it easy for honestly people like me where I'm like, I think it's this, and this. It's like, no, I was in the completely wrong direction. Thank you to, Corey, Marshall, Paul, or Ailey, whatever, I pointed something out that I didn't necessarily take into account. So definitely awesome to see there. I cannot wait to watch this broadcast team. I cannot wait to watch this. But with all that said, let's go ahead, shift some gears. Get it? It's a car joke because, we're AETHERDRIFT. Let's shift gears to the limited format and let's kind of talk about what exactly we're looking for when we're watching these players draft. And maybe for us, if we decide to learn this format and pick it up and draft it ourselves here. So it's going to be a little bit of double duty here where we're going to try to teach you some of the archetypes of the format and get into some of the cards you're going to be looking for if you look to play these archetypes in your own personal draft. Or again, looking to see what these players are kind of drafting, what they're working towards, and what they're hoping to open in their own personal drafts here at the Pro Tour. First, we're going to start with the mechanics of AETHERDRIFT before we actually get into the draft archetypes. And the first one I want to start with is crew/saddle. They both work kind of the same way. They require you to tap a number of creatures with power equaling the saddle or the crew cost of the card to be able to get either the benefit of saddling the creature or to turn the crew vehicle into an actual creature. So there is some differences. Crew, you could essentially activate at any time. You can do it on your opponent's turn. You can do it on your own turn. With saddling, you can only do it on your turn and at sorcery speed. So your opponent couldn't go to kill one of your creatures and then you saddle in response. Like saddling has to be done at sorcery speed. So that's a little bit of a bummer there. Vehicles are going to be a little bit more aggressively costed. I mean, a 3-mana 3/3 Flying Vigilance would absolutely be a super playable card in just about any draft format. But with it being a vehicle, it doesn't really do anything until you have a creature or creatures with total power 1 or greater to actually crew the vehicle. Whereas mounts get better when you saddle them and attack. They do get some kind of benefit in the case of District Mascot. You end up getting a +1/+1 counter on this creature, so it ends up growing and growing every time you attack with it while it's saddled. But if you don't have anything to saddle it, it's still at least a creature, where a vehicle just doesn't really do you any good on the battlefield if you don't have any creatures. So it's kind of a two-way street with these. I mean, again, mounts are a little bit lower impact, I would say. Like, they're definitely understated if you don't have anything, but they are still creatures. Creatures do win games of limited, where vehicles are going to be more aggressively costed, but you need additional creatures to be able to crew them and actually be able to attack, block, or do things with them as creatures. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're watching, is even though the vehicles are going to be hitting a lot harder, I would say, on average than maybe some of the other mount creatures, especially on like empty boards and stuff, you do need to remember that you could just get to a point where you don't have any creatures, you're top decking lands, and you just have 2-3 vehicles sitting on the battlefield doing nothing, where at least your mount creatures could potentially do something if you end up drawing additional things. And even if they don't, they're still creatures and they can even get in vehicles and stuff like that. Even though I don't know if you want your District Mascot necessarily piloting an air response unit when you gotta go on a saving mission. I don't see a barrel on this dog, so I don't think it's going to be much help. But moving on to the next mechanic, we have Start Your Engines. Now, this only happens if you play a card like Streaking Oil Gorger that has the ability Start Your Engines. So if you have no speed, it starts at 1, and then you increase it once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life, and max speed is 4. And it usually ends up, the cards that start your engines, not all of them, but most of them, if they have start your engines, they have some sort of benefit of getting to max speed. So in this case, for this creature will have lifelink if you have max speed. So you start at 1, And then even the turn that you start your engines, like if say that Streaking Oil Gorger is your first card and you start your engines with this card, you get attack for 3 and you hit your opponent, your speed will go up to 2. And then the next turn, if you deal damage to your opponent or if they lose life, they end up going to 3. And then 4 for the next time, and you max out at 4. You can't go any higher than that. And there's no benefit really to go any higher than that. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. That's going to be what players kind of have to juggle on top of doing combat, where, you know, most of the time you would be fine with a creature getting across for 1 or 2 points of damage, but maybe it'll have you think twice when, you know, they kind of get their engines going and they know that they're going to be going from 2 to 3 or potentially 3 to 4. You kind of have to weigh that, you know, cost analysis to see if that's actually worth letting your opponent go up in speed, or if it's just worth to kind of block it and potentially get blown out by some kind of combat trick. Next, we have Exhaust. Exhaust is abilities on creatures or on permanents that you can activate them, but you can only activate them once. So in the case of Hazard of the Dunes, for 7 mana, you can put 3+1/+1 counters on this creature. You can then not activate that ability again. You can't activate it like twice in a row. Like you can't activate the exhaust ability and then your opponent goes to give it like -6/-6, and then you activate it again to try to save it. It doesn't work that way. You get one shot to activate it, and then that's it. Now, there's a little bit of an asterisk with that. Say Hazard of the Dunes ends up dying, and then we end up returning to the battlefield with some kind of animate dead type effect, we can reactivate the exhaust ability of this card. Same thing if it were to get bounced and replay it, if it were to be flickered, bounced, whatever the case may be, as long as it becomes a new object in the game, where normally if it changes zones for any reason, then the exhaust ability is able to be reactivated. Now, this doesn't mean that if you flicker this and it has the counters on it, it's going to come back with the counters, and then you're going to be able to react with the exhaust ability. That's not how it works. It's going to lose its counters and stuff. So, but that is something to keep in mind, that just because you activate this specific Hazard of the Dunes exhaust ability, it doesn't mean now for the rest of the game you can't activate it. It just means as long as it is on the battlefield or in that same zone, you cannot activate that exhaust ability unless it gets flickered, bounced, returned from the graveyard, or returned from the graveyard to your hand and then put back into play. So just something to kind of keep in mind. And again, you're not able to respond to the activation of this specific exhaust ability with the same ability. It doesn't care if it already resolved or not, kind of like with Adapt in some of the older sets. Like this is, you can only do this once and then that's it. So unless, again, any of the situations we kind of talked about come up. Finally, we have Cycling. This is super simple. They've been doing this a lot in most of the sets here, but Cycling, you usually end up paying a cost and having to discard the card to then draw a card. This typically comes up on cards, you know, like Light Shield Parry, where let's say you don't have a creature in play. This is super easy. You pay 2 mana, discard or draw a card, if you don't think that you actually need the Light Shield Parry for maybe a future turn. So Cycling, super simple concept. A lot of, I'd say like a lot of fun as a mechanic, in the sense that it allows you to do something with your mana, and there's plenty of cards in the set that do have Cycling that are pretty decent cards that just have that little extra something that you can do to hopefully end up getting something a little bit better than, you know, maybe the spell that you are cycling. So that's the mechanics for Aetherdrift. Here are the draft archetypes. You can, of course, kind of pause. I'm going to explain them as much as I can. But, you know, typically in like the Esper colors, like the blue-white and the blue-black are going to be in kind of this artifact deck. But they play out very differently. The blue-black artifact decks try to like drain your opponent. There's some pretty good signpost cards, which are cards that are in these two color combinations that feed directly into the archetype that you're trying to play. You know, we have like max speed attrition and black-white. The two creatures in that set allow you to sacrifice creatures to surveil, and then when you have max speed, you end up making a 2/2 zombie, and then whenever this creature enters the battlefield, you make a 2/2 zombie, and, you know, you drain your opponent whenever a creature you control dies. So you can sacrifice the surveil, drain your opponent, make a 2/2, and then you're able to sacrifice another creature to make another 2/2, drain your opponent, so on and so forth. So that's the kind of cards you're looking for. Max speed aggro, and, you know, to a point, I would say like the exhaust mid-range, are decks that can get to max speed very quickly, as soon as maybe like turn 4 or turn 5, and they end up getting a lot of big payoffs from it. But the green-red deck also is very much known for the exhaust mechanic, where you have creatures that can either reduce the cost of exhaust of exhaust abilities. There is even a creature in this set that allows you to activate an exhaust ability if you hadn't already activated an exhaust ability that turn, even if that same one has been activated, which is kind of weird, but like the card itself is kind of fine because it also has an exhaust ability that you can just activate to put a counter on it repeatedly. But that's still a really cool card that also fits into something like green blue, where you have plenty of cards that you can exhaust to end up drawing cards, end up ramping you, putting lands on the battlefield, that sort of thing. And of course, my favorite archetype so far in this set is the vehicles and mounts midrange and the graveyard based decks. The vehicle and mounts midrange deck definitely pays you off for having a good amount of mounts and vehicles, because the creatures want you to then mount and saddle your things and then attack with them, so you can put +1/+1 counters on different amounts of vehicles. And even some of the other signpost cards allow you to put additional +1/+1 counters on those creatures if they were to get +1/+1 counters. So it's definitely a very tough strategy. I mean, there's been plenty of times where I'm like, I'm going to draft something else, and I just get past all the signpost cards for green-white, and it's like, well, I guess I'm playing green-white, and I think I haven't gotten less than 6 wins out of a possible 7, the how many times I've drafted it. And the green-black graveyard deck is just kind of like this kind of fun, dirtily deck that you just end up being able to haymaker your opponent with these big things, return them from the graveyard, get value from them dying, so on and so forth. It's been one of my favorites. I think red-white is something that players can do, but I don't typically, every time I've watched people draft it, I've been very unimpressed necessarily with red-white. But a lot of what I think players are going to be looking to draft are green-blue, or even green-red strategies, because loot is an absolute bomb. There's also a few of the gods in the set as well that are pretty big bombs that the green decks would like to go get. But I think overall, for me anyway, green-white and green-black feel like some of the best decks you can play. White-black has been pretty strong for me, especially if you can make it work. And the discard aggro deck has been very annoying, just getting to play the Mako and even the Flyer that has the same ability as the Mako to kind of go in and just deal tons of damage to your opponent and just cycle cards and be able to bounce your opponent's things and draw cards, and just always seem to have 4 or 5 cards in hand when you're just having to play to the board and your things are dying, and you're down to 1 or 2 cards, and again your opponent just has a full grip with a 4/5 flyer and a 5/5 attacker on the ground. Is just absolutely insane. But that's kind of a rough idea of what to expect from AETHERDRIFT draft. You're going to be looking for essentially the cards that are in these 2 color combinations, because they are going to feed directly into the archetypes of the format. I don't think there's really any cards that are, say, in green-black that don't necessarily care about doing the graveyard thing or whatever the case may be. Same thing with green-white, green-blue, so on, and all these. So that's what you're going to be looking for when you're drafting the set, and when you're going to be watching the other players draft the set. That's what they're going to be looking for and what they're going to be trying to do. Obviously, if you try to do blue-white, it's going to be harder to do the discard aggro type thing. You definitely want to try to stay 2 colors. 3 colors is possible for certain bombs. There are some pretty great 3 color cards that you can splash that are very powerful in the set, like Loot that we talked about. Just being an annoying attacker, drawing you a bunch of cards, being able to ramp you a little bit if you need to be able to double spell, or maybe play a spell plus activate an exhaust ability. Dealing 3 damage to something, which is going to help it beat a lot of 5 toughness creatures in combat. There's just a lot going on in this draft archetype. There's so many decisions, and I've been completely enjoying this draft experience. So definitely, if you have not gotten into it, I recommend it, because it's been a lot of fun so far. But that's as much time as we'll spend on draft. Now let's go to what most of you probably came for, and that's the standard metagame and kind of what to expect from this meta as we get ready to kind of go into the main event of the Pro Tour. So starting up, we will talk about the Esper Pixie deck. I'm going to lump in the Dimir Self-Bounce deck. They're kind of playing off the same idea of just trying to, get card advantage with this deck, not necessarily by drawing more cards than your opponent, but playing essentially the same powerful, cheap cards over and over again to be able to interact with your opponent and just kind of put them behind the 8 ball, because you're just going to be getting tons and tons of value from these cards. So we see things like Hopeless Nightmare, Nightmare, Storm Chaser's Talent, Nowhere to Run, being kind of the cards that players go to for a plethora of different things. Hopeless Nightmare is going to get a card out of your opponent's hand and cause them to lose 2 life. Storm Chaser's Talent is going to make a 1/1, which has some applications later down the road. Nowhere to Run is essentially our kind of catch-all-ish removal spell. It's going to give -3/-3 to a creature an opponent controls on a turn, and it's going to allow us to ignore hexproof and ward abilities. So if our opponent decides to try to like Snakeskin Veil, or with Innkeeper's Talent having it up to level 2, we're going to be able to ignore the ward and again the hexproof of those cards thanks to Nowhere to Run, especially with it just sitting on the battlefield. Now, again, like playing these cards one time, like playing Hopeless Nightmare once to get a card out of your opponent's hand, lose 2 life. Some decks, maybe that's fine. Same thing with Storm Chaser's Talent. It's a fine card that just sits on the battlefield. Eventually, you get it up to level 3, and then now your instant sorceries are going to allow you to make 1/1 prowess otters and stuff. And Nowhere to Run, getting to remove a creature is great. Even Witch's Vanity to a point, getting to kill a creature with mana value, an opponent controls mana value 2 or less, create a food token, potentially pick this back up before it actually gets to the 3rd chapter. So then you can then kill another creature, make another food token, so on and so forth. But this deck is not looking to do those things once. It is looking to do them repeatedly. And it gets to do that with one of the best cards in the format, I believe, in This Town Ain't Big Enough. 5 mana, return up to 2 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands, but this spell costs 3 less to cast if it targets a permanent you control. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to target one of your opponent's things, one of your things. This can target both of your things and still cost 2 mana. So that's huge when, with this, like, yeah, you can pick up one of your Storm Chaser's Talents, Nowhere to Run's, Hopeless Nightmares, and then bounce one of your opponent's creatures. That's kind of why playing a lot of these big cards that really don't do much or need to attack are a little risky currently in this format because of how popular things like Go for the Throat are, Nowhere to Run, and to a point like Grimbauble just being enough to interact with some of the more low-to-the-ground things that are a little bit better in the format. But playing these big creatures are kind of a problem, I would say, because of cards like This Town Ain't Big Enough, just being able to bounce it to your opponent's hand, you get no value, and I'm going to be bouncing Hopeless Nightmare, Storm Chaser's Talent, Nowhere to Run, so then I'm going to have removal, another 1/1, or I'm going to have, have you discard a card and lose 2 life. So it can kind of play this attrition-y game, especially like picking up Hopeless Nightmare and replaying it multiple times is no joke. When I spend 4 mana to make you lose 8 life and discard 4 cards, that's pretty huge. And getting to also add things like Fear of Isolation to the board, which are going to have you return a permanent to your hand as an additional cost to cast it, so your opponent isn't even going to get the chance to necessarily blowing up one of those cards with something like, say, This Town Ain't Big Enough, where, you have to put it on the stack, your opponent can blow it up, whatever. Fear of Isolation is an additional cost to cast it, returns it to your hand, meaning that your opponent never has the opportunity to actually get rid of the permanent unless they are proactive in doing so. Optimistic Scavenger is going to also help us get even more value by saying whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield or whenever you fully unlock a room, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. This means that when you're playing your Pixies, your Mockingbirds, your Fear of Isolations, you're going to be able to move +1/+1 counters on them to make them even bigger. They're going to be evasive threats with Fear of Isolation, Nurturing Pixie, and Mockingbird all have flying, and Mockingbird even copying whatever creature it is to then also just give it flying. A little less good, I would say, with your things like playing a Mockingbird and then playing Optimistic Scavenger on turn 1, Mockingbird, and then playing like a Hopeless Nightmare to get a bunch of these Optimistic Scavenger triggers, and then just to kind of keep comboing from there is pretty big game, honestly. And this deck is super annoying because you don't want to, play 1-for-1 spells, because this deck is so low to the ground that it's going to play multiple spells a turn for ideally the whole game, and you have to figure out a way to beat that. And if your answer for that is big things, well, then they can just kind of bounce your thing while also getting to do their thing. So this deck is just very annoying. I am quick to call it one of the best decks in the format, and definitely a deck that I think is going to be up there. If it's not the most registered deck, it has to be top 2. Like I doubt that if it's not first, it's second. And I think that's just depending on how players feel, like if they need to go a lot bigger. I think one of the ways that you could potentially beat this deck is if you are able to kind of get your value from playing it. And we're going to look at a set of decks where I kind of like the idea of just kind of to play things and kind of maintain some card advantage and just kind of force your opponent to have to interact with these things over and over and over again, which this deck, as you can kind of notice, doesn't really play any counters main. Thanks to Spell Pierce and Grimdauble being printed in AETHERDRIFT, though, they now have a little bit more fight in them to kind of be able to interact with kind of what's going on from the opponent's side. So, and also no more lies on the sideboard as well. So definitely some counter magic there to kind of interact more with what's going on. But with that said, I think that this deck going into the tournament is definitely a threat. You have to be prepared to play against this deck, and there's just going to be tons and tons and tons of value. It is definitely not unbeatable by any stretch of the imagination. We did see it lose at least a few times on camera at the Atlanta Spotlight Series, but of course this is over a month later. This is the Pro Tour. This is some of the best players in the world. We're going to be watching them, basically put this deck through the ringer and finding out the best 75 possible to try to go and win a Pro Tour. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at some other decks that I think could potentially challenge Esper Pixie, that at least they have some things that I personally like where I would play this deck, but if I were to, have to play something else, like these are some of the other decks that I would at least consider playing. So next we have the Domain deck, and the thing that I really like about Domain is just the fact that it gets to play Up the Beanstalk and Leyline Binding get to be very efficient spells. So Up the Beanstalk, when it enters or you cast a spell mana value 5 or greater, you end up drawing a card. You end up playing, Overlord of the Mistmorts, Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Flood Pits, and when you impen these cards, so Flood Pits and the Overlord of the Hauntwoods are 3 mana, Overlord of the Mistmorts is 4. Even though you are casting them for the impending, which obviously isn't 5 mana, the converted mana cost of the spell is still 5, or over 5. So you end up drawing cards. Now, Overlord of the Mistmorts, like you're kind of fine with these getting bounced to a certain point. I mean, Flood Pits is just going to allow you to draw 2 cards, discard a card. Probably the worst one, why you only see it at 1 copy. But Overlord of the Hauntwoods, just gradually putting more and more lands into play. They are every basic land type, so they end up satisfying the need for Leyline Binding, so it only costs like 1 mana. But you're going to get to the point where you're just stacking up so much mana, and ideally you have 1 or 2 Beanstalks in play, meaning that you get to draw a bunch of additional cards, and that you're going to find interaction for your opponent's creatures, for their permanents, that it's not going to matter that they're making you discard a card maybe every turn, or they're killing like one of your small creatures. Ideally, their removal spells aren't really going to affect your creatures. I mean, 6/6, 6/5, 5/3, Overlord of the Flood Pits is, I guess, the one that's like really in trouble. But, outside of the black decks playing Nowhere to Run, thanks to Zur, you end up giving your enchantment creatures Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. So even against the aggro decks, if you're able to kind of stave off the, first few turns of aggro, you can end up getting like an Overlord of the Hauntwoods impended and make an everywhere land, and then play a 5th land, and then you're able to play Zur, turn it into a 5/5 Death Touch, Lifelink, Hexproof creature, attack, make another token, and then just get in a bunch of damage, and again force your opponent to have to answer Zur that turn, or else you're going to be able to play more of these Overlords. You're going to end up making more tokens, meaning that now your creatures are just going to be a lot bigger, and you're going to end up getting more value. You see like Wraths, like Pest Control is going to be a pretty good one. If your opponent just kind of like goes and does their thing and they leave their permanents on the battlefield, Pest Control is just going to sweep them all away, and that's like one way that you can definitely kind of punish them. I mean, we've seen things like the Eerie creature that's just going to put +1/+1 counters on things. Storm Chaser's Talent, the Hopeless Nightmare, and even Grim Bauble are cards that they want to kind of pick up and play because they are very cheap. That you're just going to be able to kind of sweep those away if your opponent just leaves them vulnerable, and it's going to set them back pretty far, especially if you can get like a 5 for, even like a 3 for 1 or a 4 for 1 for 2 mana is absolutely amazing. Elspeth's Might, some more like early things that you can kind of do to interact with like their creatures, as well as like the other aggro decks. Get Lost is just kind of like a catch-all for creatures, enchantments, or planeswalkers. Analyze the Pollen is going to be able to search a library for a basic, or if you can collect Evidence 8, meaning that you can exile 8 converted mana cost worth of things from your graveyard, then you're going to be able to search for a creature or a land, meaning that you can get one of these Overlords, or you can find Zur and kind of do the thing, or even Beza, which is a pretty good aggro stopper. Herd Migration as well, making a bunch of 3/3s, or just getting to search for a basic land and gain 3 life. There's just a lot of things going on here where I think you can gain enough life against some of the aggro decks to where you can kind of stave off, you can stave off death for a while. And I think that there's enough here to where, especially the aggro matchup, you can turn the corner fairly quickly while also having a little bit of game against these like Esper mid-range decks where I think you're just a bigger mid-range deck, to where as long as they don't have necessarily like a super nut draw where like they put, a bunch of these creatures into play and they're hitting you for like 6, 7, 8 damage right off the rip, and you're not able to effectively interact with their things, which, I mean, could possibly happen. But at least with this domain deck, it's in a spot where I kind of like it, to where if this was a way that players kind of tried to attack the Esper matchup, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised, because again, I think that you kind of blank a decent amount of the removal from them. I mean, even if they use their removal spells to kill Overlord of the Mistmore, like the 2/1 tokens, you're kind of fine with that because you already got your value from Overlord of the Mistmores, and there's a chance that you can just animate it with a Zur and hit your opponent, or eventually just get enough mana to where you are casting it and your opponent has to have multiple different ways to pick up the same card and replay it to end up getting rid of Overlord of the Mistmores, to which then, you're kind of fine in that exchange because you still have a bunch of 2/1s left over. And it only gets worse from there. So definitely, I would not be surprised if Domain was kind of the way to go to try and attack what these other decks kind of have going on, especially like the Esper and the Dimir bounce decks. But obviously, this is just kind of like a feeling for me personally. There is no like hard data, I would say, that is like, okay, like this is exactly the deck that you should be playing. I just think that there's a lot going on here with how it interacts with the entirety of the format, rather than just one singular deck, to where this seems like a very solid option kind of going forward for this standard event. Now, there's a few other decks I want to look at that I also just personally really like. There's a lot of stuff going on that I think also interacts very well with some of the other black-based mid-range decks that are looking to definitely directly interact with the board and kind of what's going on. So another deck I really like is Selesnya Cage. Selesnya Cage is based around this card Collector's Cage, to where for 2 mana it enters play. You have Hideaway 5, so when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, you exile one face down, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Then you can pay 1, tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you may play the exile card without paying its mana cost. So with this, you can actually ignore like the restrictions of cards. So, you have things like creatures that don't have flash, you can end up activating Collector's Cage on your opponent's turn, and then being able to cast that creature or whatever without paying its mana cost on your opponent's turn, which can set up some pretty interesting scenarios with cards like Overlord of the Mistmores, which seems like the one that you're absolutely looking to kind of slam into play, or maybe even like Brightglass Gearhulk to kind of get more things into your hand and kind of get that card advantage going. Plus, it's a really big creature, 4/4 first strike trample, and you're kind of okay with this card getting bounced because it's still doing something. Eventually, you're going to have enough lands in play to where you're going to be able to play Brightglass Gearhulk, play the 2 things that you get, and even if your opponent bounces this, you still have 2 creatures in play as well. Just kind of try to get back and pressure your opponent. So some other cool things kind of going on here. You get to play like Llanowar Elves. Paw Patch Recruit is a card that I really like when your opponent is trying to replay certain cards, because if you're just able to amass a pretty decent sized board, eventually when you get to the point where your opponent is able to actually target certain things, you are then going to be able to get +1/+1 counters on other creatures, meaning that power isn't necessarily fully lost. You're getting to put, counters on these other creatures. And then if you have multiple Paw Patch Recruits in play, which with Offspring, you are able to then, get this card and essentially get 2 creatures off of 1 hit from Brightglass Gearhulk, meaning that with multiple Paw Patch Recruits in play, you're going to be putting 2, 3, 4 +1/+1 counters on other creatures on the battlefield and being able to spread those counters out, making it harder for your opponent to effectively manage the board, where it's actually a lot better for them to not even interact with the creatures you have in play, rather than actually trying to get rid of them, unless they have, some sort of board wipe like Day of Judgment, like Sunfall, things of that nature. Tender Wild Guide, too, is a pretty interesting one. I really like this card. The fact that it's a 2-mana 2/2, you can Offspring it, and then you can put +1/+1 counters on this creature. It also ramps you as well, so it's a pretty nice option there. Enduring Innocence, allowing you to draw extra cards. Sandstorm Salvager is going to make 2 different bodies, and again, this is like a creature that you're kind of fine with getting bounced because it's a 1/1 that is going to make a 3/3. More than likely, your opponent's going to bounce the 3/3, but this also just getting to put +1/+1 counters on creature tokens you control and giving them trample is absolutely menacing. Sigmund Evangelist, making a 1/1 bat whenever it enters or dies, and then Battle Cry, meaning that when it attacks, it's giving your other creatures +1/+0. This deck can just kind of generate a lot of power, I would say, a lot of attacking power. Just by playing out its things. It's kind of fine with a lot of these things getting bounced. Like Llanowar Elf obviously isn't like super amazing to get bounced, but you know, if your opponent's going to try to bounce these creatures with Paw Patch Recruit out, you're going to be able to put counters on your creatures. If they're going to bounce, you know, things like Tender Wild Guy, like, yeah, you might have +1/+1 counters on it, but you're going to be able to offspring it later and create more tokens. Like, these offspring cards are going to be kind of rough to interact with if they're just going to try to bounce like the physical ones. They're going to have to bounce the tokens, which really isn't necessarily a good value because you already got your value out of the creature once it entered play. And again, like Enduring Innocence, especially with these other offspring cards, I mean, they're going to trigger off these anyway, so you're going to be able to get them from Enduring Innocence as well. So definitely a lot of really cool stuff here. Again, just doing some things that I really like. This list in particular, not playing main deck Wiltleaf Liege, which is a card that some players like to play, like this and Obstinate Baloth, that whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls would cause you to discard a card, you put it on the battlefield instead of putting it in your graveyard. So when your opponent decides to Hopeless Nightmare, you can just put a Wiltleaf Liege into play or an Obstinate Baloth and just kind of get them in a way. So definitely really cool there. I really like this deck, just specifically for that. I think it's just very annoying to kind of deal with the creatures, especially when they kind of get their things in play. And I think Bright Glass Gearhulk also just gives it another level of consistency where it's a better creature, I think, on rate, and it goes and gets a lot of the things that you're kind of looking for, because you can go and get things like Dusk Rose Reliquary, Basilisk Collar, Haywire Might, or even like Llanowar Elves, Paw Patch Recruits. And, you know, you're not necessarily okay with this getting bounced repeatedly, but it's a creature that does demand an answer because you're almost never beating it in combat. And again, if your opponent is just going to bounce it or you're able to replay it, whatever, you're just going to continue to kind of get value off this for the next few times that you cast it. And then ideally you're able to cast it and also play out these things where now you're just, again, playing multiple spells in a turn, which I think is punishing a lot of what the Esper decks are trying to do. So that's how I feel about Selesnya Cage. There's probably one or two more decks I want to touch on before we kind of wrap this thing up. So lastly, here we have Gruul Aggro. Gruul Aggro has been kind of the staple aggro deck of Standard for quite a few formats, actually, and it's a lot of the same here. You know, we still have the kind of mouse package where we're looking at Heartfire Hero, who can grow insanely big and then just blow up and deal tons and tons of damage to each of our opponents. In this case, just one. Then we have things like Emberheart Challenger and Manifold Mouse at the 2-mana slot, where Emberheart Challenger is a 2/2 haste prowess creature that whenever it becomes a target with a spell or ability for the first time each turn, you exile a top card of your library, and until end of turn, you may play that card. So if you have a land drop to make and you end up exiling a land, you can play the land. If it's a spell, you have the mana for it, you can end up playing the land. And then we have Manifold Mouse, which is a free way to trigger both the Valiant abilities of Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger, where at the beginning of combat on your turn, you can target a mouse you control, and it gains your choice of Double Strike or Trample, and you can offspring it for 2 mana, meaning that for 4 mana, you get a 1/2 and a 1/1 that are going to ideally give either 2 mice, Double Strike, or Trample, or some combination of those, or of course 2 different ones, some combination of those. Something like that. And that's what we consider the mouse package of the deck, are these 3 mice, all at 4 copies. There's a lot of curves that you can do where you have Heartfire Hero on 1, Manifold Mouse on 2, then you can just end up getting in tons and tons of damage, and of course in conjunction with cards like Monstrous Rage, where you can give the creature essentially +3, permanent +1/+1, and then +2/+0 and Trample, which comes with the roll as well. So you give it a permanent +1/+1 and Trample, and then it'll get a +2/+0 with the Monstrous Rage, meaning that you can just deal an insane amount of damage with Heartfire Hero, and of course punish your opponent for being able to destroy the Heartfire Hero and not being able to exile it. This Gruul aggro deck seems to be maybe not necessarily a little more mid-rangey, but definitely in the park of like, we're fine with playing a longer game. We have like Hired Claw that's going to be able to attack and deal damage to our opponent, and of course be able to put a +1/+1 counter on it for 2 mana if our opponent has lost life this turn, the turn that we activate it. Paw Patch Recruit, another card that we really liked in the Green-White Cage deck. We're seeing it here in Gruul Aggro, where we're going to be able to put +1/+1 counters on things. It's also going to be able to trigger Valiant for Heartfire Hero and our Emberheart Challenger as well. So this is a way that we can kind of get some card advantage maybe on our opponent's turn, or if our opponent's trying to interact with our creatures, then we can end up drawing maybe something like Burst Lightning, Monstrous Rage, whatever, to end up getting some additional value that way as well. Questing Druid has been another card that doesn't want to come up, but is a card that a lot of these Gruul aggro decks have kind of played in some amounts. Some have played 2, some have played 4. This opted for 3, where this gets you some card advantage. You get to exile 2 cards until the end of until your next end step. You may play those cards, and then when you have a Questing Druid on the battlefield, it's a 2-mana 1/1 that whenever you cast a non-green spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this is another creature that can get pretty big as you kind of play some of your other red spells or your multicolored spells in your deck. That then, wears a Monstrous Rage very nicely. Screaming Nemesis is another card that stops our opponent from gaining life. If Screaming Nemesis is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any other target, and if a player is dealt damage this way, then they can't gain life for the rest of the game. 3 mana, 3/3, haste, super simple. It's a card that gets bounced, but still gets cast and still attacks and still has to be answered because it's either getting in for 3 damage or it's going to end up being able to ping things down. You can also kind of use some of your own burn spells, like Obliterating Bolt is going to deal 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and if it died this turn, it gets exiled instead. So this is like something that in the mirrors, you can end up killing a small-ish Heartfire hero with an Obliterating Bolt. You can also hit your own Screaming Nemesis and essentially have Obliterating Bolt be 2 mana, deal 4 damage to like your opponent's face in a roundabout way, because you have to then hit your own Screaming Nemesis, kill it, get it exiled, whatever. Sentinel of the Nameless City, as well as another expensive card that you don't mind replaying over and over again, because it's going to be able to make a map token. It's going to be able to target your Heartfire hero, your Emberheart Challenger, and any of your other creatures to potentially put +1/+1 counters on them. Get you a type of card advantage to where you're either going to find spells to put counters on your creatures, or you're going to be able to find lands to continue to hit your land drops and to be able to play, Sentinel of the Nameless City and then crack a map the next turn that you play it, or crack a map and then play a bunch of things, get up to Burst Lightning, so you can end up taking it to deal 4 damage to your opponent. Lastly, we have this card, Innkeeper's Talent, which is a card that we mentioned earlier. Against the nowhere to run cards, this is really annoying to give your permanents with counters Ward 1, because then obviously your opponent has to spend more mana to deal with them. So go for the throw costing 3 mana to kill like a 1-mana creature. You're so far up on that exchange, especially with something like Heartfire Hero or Hired Claw, where it's going to have ideally 2, 3, 4 counters on it. They're going to be happy to get rid of a 3/4 power creature, but you spent 1 mana and just targeted it with Innkeeper's Talent a bunch and activated Innkeeper's Talent, maybe put another creature into play as well. You're kind of fine with your opponent spending 3 mana to do that sort of thing. And for 4 mana, you can get this up there where, if one or more counters will be placed on a permanent or player, you put twice that many of that kind of counter on that permanent or player instead. Meaning that, when you're putting counters on your things with map tokens, you're getting counters with Questing Druid by casting spells, or Heartfire Hero getting counters from its own trigger. You're just going to be able to, and even from Innkeeper's Talent, putting +1/+1 counters on creatures you control, you're going to be able to essentially double those counters, and your creatures are going to get massive. Imagine having Paw Patch Recruit with like level 3 of Innkeeper's Talent. Your opponent's going to get super punished for trying to interact with your creatures, and the sideboard plan is pretty simple to say the least. More Sentinels, more Screaming Nemesises, Paw Patch Formation being a really good sideboard card, more Obliterating Bolt, Torch the Tower, and Lithomantic Barrage as more efficient kind of removal spells. And, again, this deck is kind of seeming to replace what we consider as like Gruul Prowess. I think this is an aggro deck that has a little bit more staying power, where you're kind of fine with your earlier creatures dying, and then your bigger creatures have a little bit harder of a time dying, and also kind of punish your opponent for like bouncing them and returning them to your hand, because they are, in the case of Screaming Nemesis, being able to come down and attack again anyway, or Sentinel is just going to continue to make map tokens and, potentially just put even more power on the board, or kind of dig you past some land pockets to where you can then hit your land drops to cast a lot of these big things, and then also activate abilities or play other spells, or be able to kick like Burst Lightnings and things like that. But that is kind of a quick snapshot of the standard metagame in a nutshell. We are going to be looking on Thursday, because I believe Wednesday is the final day to submit deck list. Thursday, they should have some sort of metagame snapshot of what we can kind of expect, what the percentages kind of look like. They usually come Thursday or Friday, and I believe it ends up being on Thursday, so we're going to be looking at that as well and kind of breaking it down and seeing where we're at. I kind of expect the Esper mid-range decks to be the most played decks in the format. That and followed by Gruul Aggro. I think that there's just something super simple about playing what is considered the best deck in the format going into the event and just playing it at the Pro Tour. I think that if you are a very skilled player, you had a lot of time playing the deck, etc., you're going to end up having a lot of success, and just kind of like tweaking and tuning towards certain matchups you expect to see. And I also think Girl Aggro is just a deck that if your opponent kind of stumbles, which can happen in these Esper decks where maybe you're missing blue or you end up missing white or whatever, and you're kind of stuck on just blue-black colors, which is why you kind of see, blue-black, blue-black self-balance is kind of an interesting deck choice because it's very hard for you to get screwed on colors, and that's kind of how you can lose some of the aggro decks, is just by maybe missing out on a certain color and not getting to, fully unlock your hand of being able to replay, your cards over and over again. You're kind of stuck, missing a key color to kind of enable that stuff from happening. So I would expect also a good amount of Girl Aggro, because again, this is just an aggro deck that seems to kind of toe the line between, yes, we can be this, get to the board early and deal a ton of damage, but then we can also be a deck that wants to play a little bit longer of a game where our opponent wants to kind of try to grind us out, bounce our things, kill our things, whatever the case may be. We're going to get some additional value from those things happening. And on top of that too, we're going to be able to protect them in about 95% of the cases that can be presented in Standard. So that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what you're excited most for in Pro Tour AETHERDRIFT. I am so excited to kind of bring my own kind of coverage, my own kind of spin on what's going on. Again, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on the video as well. Helps out with the algorithm, helps the channel grow. On top of that too, if you are subscribed to the channel, you're going to be able to see the breakdowns of day 1, day 2, and of course the top 8 as they come out. They're going to be staggered, so we're going to get day 1 on Saturday, even though that's going to be played on Friday, and then day 2 on Sunday, even though it's played on Saturday, so on and so forth, until, Monday we end up getting the kind of the final, the coup de grace, I suppose, of the top 8. So definitely check out that stuff, and we're going to be, of course, breaking down and kind of figuring out what we learned from these events, and it's going to be something that we do for all the Pro Tours, we do for the World Championship, what we do for the Regional Championships, so definitely be on the lookout for all that stuff if you are so inclined to. But yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. I hope to see you all in the next one.